Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Anne Marie Lipinski. I'm the curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism. Uh, as a young girl with dreams of becoming a journalist, the name and legacy of I.F. Stone loomed large. He was someone who also dreamed big as a teenager and then pursued that dream with vigor, temerity, and a stubborn devotion to truth. Of the various journalistic brands that formed the orbit of my Midwest childhood, the name I.F. Stone stood beside Walter Cronkite's as a powerful force for verity, perhaps the most independent there was. So I am especially honored and privileged to welcome you to the 2012 I.F. Stone Award, which this year is being given to Sandy Close, a remarkable woman about whom we will learn more in a moment. On behalf of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard, which administers the award, we thank all of you for joining us. There are a couple of people, though, I would like to extend a special welcome to. First of all, Celia Gilbert, Mr. Stone's daughter, who is an artist and poet in Chicago. Thank you so much for being with us this year, Celia. I.F. Stone Medal Committee Chairman Bill Kovich, who will speak in a moment. Myra McPherson, who is also a member of the selection committee and author of I.F. Stone's biography with a really righteous title, which is All Governments Lie. The Life and Times of Rebel Journalist I.F. Stone, and selection committee member Peggy Engel, who is executive director of the Alicia Patterson Journalism Foundation, a member of the Nieman Advisory Board, and a Nieman Fellow. And I say that because my curator, Bill Kovich, taught me to say there are no former Nieman Fellows. Before I move to making the award, I want to add one last thing, lest we make the mistake of thinking of Izzy Stone and his legacy as somehow anachronistic, a word that he himself used in his writings. What I didn't realize as a schoolgirl, or none of us would have, reading of his lone warrior-like investigations, was that Stone was also pioneering a new journalistic model. Something not just independent of the halls of power, but of business conventions of news gathering. Listen to this one thing he wrote and see if you don't find in his words the formation of a now very familiar model and the roadmap that would lead you to many of the journalists whose work you read today, some of whom are in this room with us today. He wrote, "In this age of corporation men, I am an independent capitalist, the owner of my own enterprise, subject to neither mortgager or broker, factor or patron. In an age when young men setting out on a career of journalism must find their niche in some huge newspaper or magazine combine, I am a wholly independent newspaper man, standing alone, without organizational or party backing, beholden to no one but my good readers. I'm even one up on Benjamin Franklin. I do not accept advertising." One of Sandy Close's greatest contributions to journalism has been her mentoring and discovery of young reporters, a fact that holds special resonance for me this evening. In turning the podium over to Stone Committee Chairman Bill Kovich, I would like to recognize him as an extremely important mentor in my own life and career. He was my Nieman curator, a post he held at Harvard for a decade. Before that, he served as editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Washington bureau chief for the New York Times, and a reporter who covered politics, poverty, and civil rights for the Tennessean. He is founder of the Committee of Concerned Journalists and co-author of a seminal book on journalism, The Elements of Journalism, What News People Should Know and the Public Should Expect. I should also say, on a personal note, to the current Nieman class, who sometimes may wonder where I learned to crack the whip, you need look no further than Mr. Kovich. Bill.
Thank you, Anne Marie. That was more than I deserved, but I'll accept it. Before I make my little remarks, you asked me to talk a little bit about Izzy Stone and knowing Izzy Stone. I just want to mention one thing about Izzy that most of us don't talk about, and that is it could be dangerous to know Izzy Stone. I got to know him when I was in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, and when I became bureau chief, I set up Friday brown bag lunch with my staff to every Friday to talk about the week's work, what we had done well, what we had loused up, what we were going to do next week, and once in a while I would have a speaker in. And the first speaker I invited to come talk to the New York Times Washington Bureau was Izzy Stone. I had subscribed to Izzy's newsletter when I was working down south. Didn't have much feed in from people who knew what they were doing outside of Tennessee, but Izzy's newsletter helped me understand the kind of journalism I wanted to do. And so I had Izzy in to talk to the staff, and when I got back into my office after the lunch, my secretary had the phone waiting for me. Abe Rosenthal, the executive editor of the New York Times, heard I'd had Izzy Stone into the New York Times, and he was climbing the walls. He said he did not think Izzy Stone was the proper model for a New York Times reporter. So. But we laughed about it, and he came back a couple more times. Anyway, I am very pleased and I'm very appreciative that I've been asked to chair the committee to find a recipient for this award this year. One of the unique things about the I.F. Stone Award is that a number of the people on the committee, I think most of the people on the committee, knew Izzy personally and were affected by the special niche that he had carved out in American journalism. Peter Osnos started his career in journalism working on Izzy's weekly newspaper. Myra McPherson, as Anne Marie mentioned, wrote the definitive biography, and she, along with Bob Giles, were basically responsible for establishing this award here at the Nieman Foundation with money from the family. So this committee made up of people like that, and Peg Engel, who introduced our recipient to the committee this year, are all people who feel a personal responsibility for choosing someone to receive this award who reflects the standards that Izzy Stone introduced through his weekly to a new generation. Along with all the others on the committee, we have tried to find someone who would meet the standard that Izzy set with each issue of the I.F. Stone Weekly, to write the truth, to defend the weak against the strong, and to fight for justice. The result is that the decision of a recipient for each of the award, for each of them, was a personal responsibility to find a journalist who met that standard and who lives up to the rhetoric of free speech and the free press, and above all, one who reflects the independence for which Izzy Stone's name has become a watchword. Sandy Close clearly meets all those standards, sometimes called whirlwind close by the people who know her best. She has dedicated her career to probing the social fragmentation of our society and the breakdown of our social fabric, to expose issues like the inexcusable rate at which black males in America are locked away in our prisons, the kind of issues that the mainstream press treats as exotica. Not only has she kept issues like this from disappearing behind a wall of journalistic indifference, but for 40 years she has nurtured and launched a generation of talented, award-winning young journalists who continue to find ways to bring those on the margins of society to our attention in all of their human dimensions, writing truth, defending the weak, fighting for justice. The New America Foundation that she founded is the first and largest national collaboration of ethnic news organizations, and it connects over 57 million members of the population, not only driven by its hope for a more productive future in a new country, but one that inspires a larger dream of a more open, a more inclusive, and a more just society. And it's the fastest growing sector of American journalism, and one dedicated to the goals that Izzy Stone set for himself: to write the truth, to defend the weak, and to seek justice. In another significant way, Sandy Close draws attention to a less noted factor about Izzy Stone's success. As the first woman to receive the I.F. Stone Medal, Sandy represents a generation of female journalists who now routinely not only lead news organizations, but who exemplify the highest standards of independent, rigorously documented investigative reporting. In so doing, Sandy Close helps us remember the role that Esther Stone played in the I.F. Stone Weekly. As Izzy wrote in a line that he put above the masthead of the final edition of the I.F. Stone Weekly, quote, "In gratitude to my wife, Esther, her collaboration, her unfailing understanding, and her sheer genius. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be able to present this year's I.F. Stone Medal to Sandy Close, someone who embodies all of the qualities that combine to make the I.F. Stone Weekly a model for the kind of journalism that accepts the responsibilities placed on it by the Constitution." So Sandy, if you would step up here and let me give you the I.F. Stone Medal. Can you give me a hug? There's a little more to this that I'll give you later, but yes.
That's wonderful.
This is yours.
Thank you. Well, yes. Well, thank you. Honestly, I didn't expect people to know me or to be able to turn out, but I do think that I.F. Stone as a drawing card is about as good as it gets. And I, too, came into journalism reading I.F. Stone. And it's interesting that in 1968, after founding and running an inner city newspaper in Oakland called the Flatlands, I went back to Asia, where I had started journalism during the war in Vietnam as a China reporter. Oh, Lord, I was 22. What did I know? About as little as I know now. For the Far Eastern Economic Review. But in those days, speaking English got you through the front door. The story of Asia was exploding. Stan Carno invited me to be the Newsweek bureau assistant in Saigon, but I didn't have the money to get from Hong Kong to Saigon, so I stayed in Hong Kong. Glad I did. But when I came back to Oakland, pulled by a love affair with that city, that you only really develop when you produce something like a newspaper in a city. It becomes your child. Every week you're producing something that draws the fabric of the city together and gives it a sense of itself. And I went back, but it was already the 1967, 68. You have no idea how the country changed in just a year. The language changed, the imagery changed, everything changed. And instead of picking up the newspaper that I had run, which had become by then black paper, which was its destiny, I started a newsletter. And guess what? It was modeled on I.F. Stone's newsletter, and it was called City in Trouble. And I wasn't sophisticated enough to know government lies as a consistent theme, but I did know enough that that newsletter, same format, no kidding, uh, was something that gave people an inside access. People who lived in the flatlands had an inside access to City Hall that they didn't otherwise have. And that was Stone's legacy to me. The newsletter lasted for about a year and a half. And then I found myself pulled into the great dramas of the trials of prisoners. I found I couldn't go by the courthouse and go on to the school board meeting and the city hall meeting. I wanted to go into the courtrooms and find out what was happening in criminal justice. And I wound up for 5 years running the defense of a man named Rochelle McGee, who was the other prisoner in the Angela Davis case, when Jonathan Jackson, on August 7th, 1970, took over the Marin County Courthouse with a shotgun and held up a courtroom and demanded the release of his brother, George Jackson, from San Quentin. And Rochelle McGee was the last survivor from that episode. He was an inmate in San Quentin. He was testifying at the time for another prisoner, and everybody was herded, the prosecutor, the judge, geez, I remember this like it was yesterday, into a waiting van to be sped off and held as hostages to demand the release of George Jackson. Does anybody in this room remember that? That was an extraordinary story, and Angela Davis became the sort of public face of that, but she, of course, hadn't been involved. But McGee was put on trial as her co-defendant. Ultimately, they severed the cases, and I spent not only 5 years covering it, I ended up running the defense of McGee. It gave me an incredible hunger. He's still in prison, by the way. It gave me an incredible hunger to build something like the way you feel when you want to have a family. And it's not so much about the person you're relating to, you just know it's a time you want to kind of build something that lasts, that's relational. I think maybe the war and the dramas of the 60s instilled that in me. I didn't want to be part of the political polarization. I wanted to be part of bringing things together. And so I started in as the new editor of Pacific News Service. And therein, a story evolves that took me to what I want to share with you today. 3 intersections in journalism that I hope will kind of give you maybe a new way of thinking about what journalism can accomplish, because that's what they did for me. I ran Pacific News Service, and around the mid-'80s began to realize that I was missing the connection to Oakland, to the people of Oakland that I had had when I was running the Flatlands. And so I began to bring young people into the newsroom. I began to go out and find young people who were at the center of what was the great epic but unreported drama of the time, which was gratuitous violence. Violence of the kind where you're not robbing for money, you're biting the corpse after you've killed the person. You're physically imprinting yourself on the other person in the absence of language, in the absence of a sense of connection, of any relational texture in your life. There was an explosion of violence, and it drew me to want to understand what that syndrome was, what was at the root of it. And we began bringing young people into the office. Adam Thompson was one of the early people who joined us, not only as a young person himself, but as somebody who helped us start writing workshops in Juvenile Hall, which now are something of a model all over the country for bringing what I would call communicators into silent spaces. Juvenile Hall is a silent space. And I cannot tell you the extraordinary way in which working with young people as a journalist, not to amplify their voice, certainly not to give voice, nobody gives voice, but really to find out what was on their minds, what they could tell me about what was going on with the violence in Oakland. See, I had that very strong connection to Oakland. And I discovered working with young people on the margins, which is where change in a culture comes from, where the energy of a culture moves. I discovered that these young people represented who we were becoming. It wasn't that they were growing up to become us or not. It was that they were a window into where our culture was evolving. And the fear of that generation, and I think it is still the fear today, is of winding up alone. Stephen King got it right in his novels, and he was the great literary guru of the 80s and 90s. He was the Stephen King he was the J.D. Salinger of that generation. For me, J.D. Salinger was the exemplar of what we in the 60s were most afraid of, becoming phony, having phony friends. Your mother serves you breakfast, and you want to tell her that you're feeling suicidal, and she says, "Don't talk with your mouth full." And you want to just get the hell out of there. Well, think Bill Clinton. But this is a generation where the universe is one of random terror. Your parents are too feeble to protect you. You're not going out to organize the good guys against the evil sheriff, because evil is your dog who turns against you, your car, your father. You remember Jack Nicklaus in The Shining, coming at you, the boy, in the bathroom, knocking down the door? Intimate life betrayed this generation. That's what I learned from these kids. And boy, did that transform my idea of what I could do as a journalist. I discovered language. I discovered the girl who joined our staff from Hunters Point and said, as the new receptionist, "Call me lady. My name is Selena, but today I'm changing it to lady." "Why?" said I stupidly. "Because that's how I want people to treat me." She had discovered language. And this, of course, was at the very beginning of the hip-hop explosion. Is it any wonder that the throb of the youth culture that grew out of that episode was one of communications. Communicate. The cell phone, the constant effort to fill the void in a relational texture way that communication could provide. And we in juvenile hall, where the kid last night says, I don't want to write, I don't want to talk. And you say, why? Because I'm depressed. Why are you depressed? And you know, kids who don't have a language don't even know how to ask themselves these questions. So you have to push. Why are you depressed? You don't know what it's like to be in a locked room. What is it like? They shut the door, they turn out the light, you're alone, you look at the wall, you see a fly crawl up the wall and disappear, and you're alone. And I am the first person that kid knows has heard his voice. And I'm totally transformed by that experience. And so I begin to feel that there is something profoundly missing in the journalism we are doing at Pacific News Service. The great vision of mainstream journalism has been to mirror who we are becoming, to give me a sense as somebody in a very eclectic city. Think of the 19th century publisher. I want to chronicle the life around me. I want to describe the city we are becoming. That's what I got when I picked up the Daily News as a kid in the subway. I could feel the city in my hands. We were missing in San Francisco the ethnic media. We were missing the fact that if you were Chinese in that city, the first largest group of ethnic immigrant people in that city, I am the editor of a news service that's supposed to reflect what people are thinking and who we are becoming. And I don't know that the Chinese paper is telling Chinese voters, vote for this, because Confucius wrote that you should have a child learn remorse. And if you lock these kids up too young, they will never have a chance to learn the meaning of remorse. Now, you learn that media that are your partners but are invisible to you, and ironically, they are called ethnic media, as if parochial and insular. Who is parochial and insular in this instance? Of course, it's me. I want to know what's in that paper. I want to know what's on the Spanish language radio when I rented the car in LA. Remember, this is the 90s, the mid-90s. And I am growing old in a city that is in not only a city, a state that is the youngest state, that is 1 out of 8 youth, but also has 40% of a population that speaks other languages. How can I be a mainstream journalist if I don't access the media serving these communities? And it was the youth experience, the idea of being able to bring young people together from the inner city, from the suburb, from the affluent school, and from juvenile hall for conversating, that freed us to believe as journalists we could also be communicators, and we could convene ethnic media and learn, greedy again, just as I was with youth, learn what the world looks like through ethnic media reporters' eyes and experiences. And that was the origin of the founding of New America Media. A final thought is that as we look at ethnic media today, and there are over 3,000 ethnic news organizations, many of which have been, like all of us in media, clobbered by the recession. Yet, as they will tell you, we are used to doing more with less. That's been our DNA. Our children inherit our papers. Our sons and daughters and granddaughters are the people who will carry it on. And you look, that is what is happening. You also see a vast expansion in the infrastructure of ethnic media. I can take you to New Orleans and introduce you to 4 different, unique, distinctive Spanish language newspapers. And I can show you in Hawaii, I was amazed. Arab newspapers, Chinese newspapers, of course it would be heavy, but 9% of Hawaii is now Hispanic, Spanish language media. It is a topography. Bosnians in St. Louis, Kurds in Nashville, Somalis in Minneapolis. We know this now, but how exciting. And imagine journalism anticipating the future. I will take you to Seoul, Korea, and you will find media I call now diaspora media. Perhaps a better term, right? More sophisticated. At the edge of the global local news curve, which is what ethnic media's strength has always been. You will find the newest ethnic media in Seoul is Peruvian. What if you bring Peruvian media together with Mongolian media in Seoul, Korea? You are anticipating the future. In the same way that when you bring ethnic media together in a city like Atlanta or Memphis or Anchorage or any number of cities, Houston, where I most recently was, and you invite them to work together on a common topic. And let's take education reform, about which their audiences know very little, yet their children are the majority of the school students. Can ethnic media work together to bring greater awareness to parents of the stakes, the high stakes in education reform today? Can they collaborate on all sorts of things? And can you, in the process, create a new architecture of communications? I was at Annenberg 2 or 3 days ago to present something that we had done with the Native American media in Northern California, the Hupa tribe, outside of Eureka. And it was a story about the impact of methamphetamine, on the Hupa reservation. And it was done with the Two Rivers Tribune, the newspaper that is Hupa run on the reservation, and the Hupa radio, the Native American radio station. And it was only Hupa talking about this issue. And the Annenberg people were fidgety. They loved the video. But they said, who got to see this? They measured the value of the media product by the size of the audience. And I said, you know, there are silent spaces growing in America. There are media deserts growing in America. The paradox of the glut of information and the growth of silent spaces. In these spaces, people are reluctant to talk about things themselves. If you, as a journalist, can help them start a conversation within their own community, that can be the end in and of itself. We were doing a story with the Native American media in Hupa to help the community own an issue about which they did not wish to talk. And only Hupa people were interviewed and talked on the video. And I realized, had we been aiming at the New York Times front page, we would probably have had to have outsiders talk about it. It would have been a totally different approach. But the advantage, the power ethnic media bring as media embedded in their communities is the trust factor. And so with them aiming at simply breaking the silence, we were able to develop a video that they could use, that was theirs, that was about them. I've thought about that because I'm very interested in silent spaces and media deserts, and my final example is something that goes back to the 19th century publisher. Years of working with young people, most of whom have been in the system, most of whom didn't even get high school degrees, but have remarkable communication skills. One of the very best writers I've had at Pacific News Service and New America Media after Richard Rodriguez is Charles Jones. And he never got through high school, has 7 children, and grew up homeless in Hunters Point. And his gift of language is extraordinary. Adam was another one. Well, we discovered that in places like Richmond, California, where the last newspaper closed down last year, a silent space, that the young people we'd worked with want to go beyond just their own voice. They want to create a media platform for the community. This is the 19th century publisher instinct. You can say it's also the child of ethnic media. It is an amazing thing that we now have 8 youth-driven community media platforms in California, from Coachella in the south up to Richmond in the north. And guess what? These young people want one format first and foremost. And you know what it is? Print. And why, you say? Because of course it's way more expensive. And they say, what do you leave at church? What can I show grandma? Who will distribute this at the Roach Coach? And so you have an ironic return to the future of a new generation of young people, African American, publishing a bilingual paper whose audience is not defined by race or ethnicity, but by geography, rediscovering the sacred meaning of community, which is shared space. And that is exciting to me. And it is like the Peruvian media and the Mongolian media in Seoul. It's anticipating the future. So I would love to welcome my colleagues, Shujun Everlane and Peggy Engel and Lisa, who will make this a much broader, I hope more pertinent to your lives conversation. But I wanted to tell you I am and remain a greedy editor. If you didn't hear the greed in there, this isn't about being good to people, finding the voiceless person. No, I am curious. I know very little. And I know in this glut of information less, goddammit, than I did 5 years ago. And the last thing I'll tell you about that is that when I was in Los Angeles, where homicide has dropped, a friend of mine, first AME pastor in South Central, said to me when I asked him why he thought it had dropped, he said it was because of the cartels. The cartels have taken over distribution of drugs in a lot of the crime-ridden areas, and they've capped drive-bys. How do you investigate that story? That's where Adam and I started. That's the kind of question we would have started from, and we would have known from accessing the kids in the hall, from accessing the Black media, and that includes some of the religious newsletters. That's how I know the pastor, Mark Whitmock. Well, how do you sustain all this? That too, I hope you will ask us. I see Joe here. There are many of us with the great challenge of sustainability before us. And if any questions come up on that, I'd love to talk about that. But I have to tell you, I am inspired every day by being able to have the opportunity to find things out, and that curiosity is what got me into this. And it's only struck me, I know less than I did when I started. So very, very eager to invite you to, if you need a voice at the other end of the phone, if you need somebody to answer an email about a story you would like to propose, yes, I brought my cards with me and would be very, very happy and eager to get to know you. Thank you very much.
My name's Laura Amico. I'm a Nieman Berkman Fellow here this year, and absolutely and totally honored to be moderating this panel here tonight. A little bit about me and why, among so many terrific fellows, I'm the one standing before you. I'm a little bit surprised too, in light of who we have here this evening. I have a small startup in Washington, D.C. called Homicide Watch, where we document every homicide in Washington using software that my husband Chris and I have built to do that. Our business model, Sandy mentioned sustainability, our business model is to license that software platform and to work with newsrooms in implementing our strategies. We partnered with Digital First Media to run Homicide Watch Trenton with the Trentonian, and just this week announced Homicide Watch Chicago with the Sun-Times. Chicago is a terrific market for us, unfortunately. That being said, really, in any community that is trying to open the conversation about homicide, I think there is an opening there. And Oakland is certainly a place for that as well. If you look at your programs, you see that the title of this panel is The Future of Independent Journalism in a Post-Journalism World. Yikes. Post-journalism is a term that makes me want to take a really deep breath, and the word future often does too. I think that this is true for a lot of us, particularly among the Nieman Fellows. When we spoke about this panel earlier this week, I heard everyone breathe in a little bit at the word future, and then again at post-journalism. They're scary words, and it's a scary world. It's a world where more and more traditional journalists are being driven into independent journalism. One where independent journalists are encountering more and more competition for funding. One where the very nature of what journalists, independent and otherwise, do is changing. I've got a little secret though. Sandy Close is a deep, calming breath in this scary world. Sandy's belief in journalism transcends her belief in media, which makes her the best type of journalist I know. One that believes in community and people and the power of storytelling. There's nothing stronger. Sandy is joined in this discussion tonight by 3 other women, which I think is fabulous, who are incredibly just as inspiring as she is. Lisa Chidekel, next to Sandy here, co-founded the Connecticut Health Investigative Team just 2 years ago in December of 2010. I'd like to wish her a very happy anniversary. 2 years is an important milestone. Apart from this, Lisa is an award-winning reporter as well as an adjunct professor at Northeastern University. Shujun Eberlin is the author of the award-winning story collection, Apologies Forthcoming. A native of Chongqing, China, she now lives in the Boston area where she's an independent writer and widely read essayist and social commentator on China. Margaret Engel, on the far end, is director of the Alicia Patterson Journalism Foundation, which supports investigative journalists and photojournalists worldwide. They do incredible, incredible work. She's a former reporter and editor for the Washington Post, is a Nieman Fellow, and one thing that I think is really, really cool, was managing editor of the museum in Washington, D.C., a terrific space. Welcome to all of you. It's really great to have you here today. So I was going to ask you first about what is independent media within this space where there is so much media. But I'll take Sandy's bait and ask about sustainability and funding. What projects are you seeing funded right now? What projects would you like to see funded? And what projects should we see funded? Peggy, if you'd like to start us off.
Sure. Well, I really feel that journalism should be more than a project, and I hate to have it narrowed down into individual topics in that way, because we are facing this crisis, and we need to have the rest of society step up and understand that this is a missing leg of a stool. And I was just speaking before this session about the fact that community foundations, of which there are about 680 in this country, need to see journalism truly as something as important to solve or to help as poverty and hunger and environmental problems. Because if you don't, I'm speaking to the choir here, of course, but if we don't have strong journalism, then really everything else can collapse pretty quickly. So even though as a foundation director, I'm able to give money to individual projects, I think that we can't duplicate the amount of information that needs to be generated by funding individual projects. We have to think in a much more global way, in a much more systemic way of understanding that this crisis is here and how we're going to solve it. Some people feel that we should have government intervene. I think most of us in this room would like that to be the very last possibility considered. But there's so much more support that needs to come from people who value journalism in their life, and it's always been essentially free to them, and it's not going to be. So the type of projects that we're seeing, that I'm seeing, are journalists turning themselves into sole proprietors, which we may all have to do. That there is no longer the newsroom where someone is standing with their notebook waiting for the editor to give them the story and to go out and report it. That business ethics and business methods have been adopted by individual journalists, and that they are becoming, as I said, sole proprietors, having partnerships with others, but really understanding that their value in society is what they can come up with in terms of a narrative and a story. So we're still seeing the whole gamut, from the environment to crime to social dislocation, being put forward, but we're seeing it from people who are doing it without the bench strength of having a newsroom behind them.
I can speak to sustainability. I came out of a newsroom, was pretty much born and raised as a regular newspaper reporter in Connecticut since I got out of college, and then 3 years ago took a buyout from the Hartford Courant. So I was only in mainstream media. I actually started off in alternative media at the New Haven Advocate for a year, but then 20 years in mainstream media. So there's a bunch of us, for you, those of you who don't know much about what happened to all those investigative reporters that used to be employed by all those big papers. We have formed these little mini centers. There's about 50 of them around the country. Some are literally one person, working from a laptop in his house, is the Oklahoma Investigative Reporting Center. I'm in Connecticut with the Connecticut Health I team, sort of chose health and safety because that was what's not getting covered in Connecticut or many other states too. And the medical industry, my big concern has always been, as an investigative reporter, when investigative reporting dies, the folks who are providing services to us, government and non-government, including medicine, know that no one's there looking anymore. So there's just this sort of watchdog function that I always hoped someone would perform and was a part of performing for a while. So that was the impetus. So I came at it from there's a bunch of us veteran journalists who are trying to start these independent centers, and we don't know the business side of things at all. And we're trying to learn. So right now, it's basically foundations will launch you. And that's how we got started, with different foundations step forward to launch you. And then there it's a small shop. I mean, there's, a core of us in Connecticut, but we're mostly doing part-time, and that's what you'll find at most of the centers around the country is 2 or 3 people are the core staff, and then there's a lot of freelancers. Obviously, there's a lot of investigative reporters out in the world who are available to do freelance projects. And the question is, the big issue is sustainability. I think you're going to see, this is my guess, and I don't know anything about the business side, but these niche markets are popping up, like the niche of Homicide Watch, and then for the niche for us is health and safety, and we're going to have to find funders who are interested in those topics, I guess. And just like there's a politics, there are politics websites and education websites and fashion websites. I mean, there's all these kind of boutique media outlets popping up in the independent journalism world. And I'm guessing we're all going to have to go after sort of we're already doing that. There's no way we're going to get hospitals and medical societies in Connecticut to fund us because we write bad stories about them. So that's not going to work for us. But and the same is true with a lot of investigative centers. You're just not going to get traditional funding. Yeah.
How do you disseminate it? Are you talking about blogs?
No, we have a website and we actually sell our content. We don't take advertising, have chosen not to go that model, which a lot of other centers do. We don't want to have the malpractice lawyers advertising on our website. So we're actually selling our content for small amounts of money to the Hartford Courant, New London Day, New Haven. We have 18, not our intent. I left newspapers with my co-founder from the Hartford Courant and said, we are so never going back to the mainstream media again. This is so nice to be away from them and just doing our own stories and investigating the way we want to investigate. And we published it on our site and Facebook and Twitter. We learned how to tweet. That took like 3 days. Figure out how you tweet a huge investigative project in a little thing that was but anyway, and then got calls from the newspapers saying, can we buy your content? We really, you're filling a void. We would really like it. So now we actually do a distribution model where we're taking in small amounts of money for like year-long subscription like AP used to do. You can buy per story. We have one newspaper in Connecticut that pays like $36 per story. We have other papers that pay, $10,000 for a year-long contract. But it's not, as Sandy knows, there's no like guidebook on how to sustain yourself.
Well,
We should mention one helpful thing. There's an organization called INN,
Yep.
Investigative News Network, which is trying to do the back office and business side in a shared operation, so that almost all of these small journalism startups are getting their libel insurance and even health insurance for employees and learning.
Help,
That is an important group if you're thinking of starting a small journalism startup. There's some help.
I could say something from an individual point of view. I'm not within any organization, and I usually don't like to be in an organization. So
why not?
She's a writer.
Well, first, I think a writer really needed to be independent. In any organization, you would have some vested interest, I think. So I like to be independent, and also it's because of my personal experience. I grew up in China. I moved to the United States in 1988, just a year before the June 4th massacre. So I grew up, we were always being like pushing around by organizations. That's the way I grew up, and I really hated it. So I don't want to be in an organization. Either you are calling yourself democracy or you're calling yourself communist. I don't want to be anyone. I just wanted to write what I think is a truthful voice.
So tell me what you are able to cover as an independent writer and what you're not able to cover as an independent writer.
Yes, what I'm not able to cover usually is because I don't have money. And so because as an independent writer, I don't make money. Anybody who's an independent writer, you know, you don't make money unless you are, maybe your novel is made of a movie or something, made into a movie. Otherwise,
filmmakers here.
So I mean, I'm not making money. The highest income I got in 1 year is I got Massachusetts Cultural Council's writer's grant, which is $7,500. That's my whole income of the year. That's my highest income I've gotten since I become a writer. So I just want to tell you one frustration I had. And you guys probably heard this year there were some very dramatic events happening in China, particularly. So, and Bo Xilai and the Wang Lijun incidents, and lots of people have heard it. And so it's covered as on the first page of New York Times and everywhere. But there are lots of things they don't know and they don't cover. And I was from Chongqing, which is where these political things happening this year. So I had lots of contacts and Chinese people who wanted to tell me inside stories, but they don't want to tell to foreign journalists. And lots of foreign American journalists approached me because they know I was from Chongqing and I have been writing extensively about China and Chongqing. So they knew. So they approached me, lots of people. They want me to give them like contacts so they can interview. So I asked my friends. No one wanted to talk to them. No one. We don't want to talk to foreign journalists. But when I go back to visit in my home city, which this year I went back 3 times. Usually I go once a year to visit my home city. And they tell me lots of things. But I don't have anybody, give me funds or anybody say, okay, you're right, we'll publish you. See, a writer, an American writer who lived in Shanghai, who wanted to write about Bo Xilai, she approached me for input. She's writing for Harper's. Okay, she approached me for input. If she uses my input, that means my writing should be able to be published in Harper's too, right? No, Harper's won't take yours, right? Because maybe you're not famous enough, or maybe you don't have connections. So I'm saying for the same quality of writing, even if I have stories, I have ability to write, I don't always get published. I mean, often I don't. So Sandy actually is very supportive of this kind of things. I first met Sandy actually in a Nieman conference here in 2006. We both were attending the conference. I didn't know her. She was sitting by a table eating breakfast. So I went there, sat at the same table, she and I, just 2 of us. And I said, "Are you a journalist?" She said, "Who isn't?" So that's the first. That was the first time we met, and so I didn't know who she was at the time. So after she answered that, I was very interested in her. So we started to talk. And at the time, I hadn't started writing any general stuff. I was writing fiction at the time. I was just thinking, I'm interested. I might wanted to write something about China. Then so I met her. Actually, she got me started really writing general stuff.
And this is a really first-rate observer, commentator, analyst, and storyteller, just first-rate. So,
thank you.
But
Sandy, let me ask you.
I'll say one thing about the sustainability, because I've been raising money for over 40 years, so I've outlived a lot of the foundations. Look, a very important trend is happening in philanthropy with regard to media. And I call it the McKinseyization of philanthropy, McKinsey being the PR firm. There's a tendency for foundations to want to make a big bang, not something they used to necessarily want to do. There was a more organic search for just somebody with fresh ideas, somebody who was pioneering. Is that Richard Parker? Hi, Richard. Yeah. And now, to quote the CEO of one of the biggest foundations, I'm interested in media, in journalism that will reach the influencers who can move the policy needle. Got that? They're going to fund ProPublica, as they should. Important. Very, very good journalism. But I said to him, the Arab Spring didn't happen because of the policy needle. You can't do one without the other. You have to know what's going on the ground. And in fact, the sort of terra incognita that is growing up around us that we don't really know enough about. You need journalism, as I said, with the hoopah, that may not move the policy needle. Maybe it'll only move that particular community. That is a sustainability challenge that I've answered to some extent through advertising and social marketing. And here is why. I share this with you because it's an important lesson. Government is having a very difficult time communicating with the governed. The governed have become fractured. The CDC looks at flu this year and it's going up, it's spiking. How does it communicate the need to get influenza shots to the Somalis, the Bosnians? It says, oh, well, we've got it in language on the website. You know what happened when SARS hit, swine flu? Koreans in Atlanta closed all their barbecue restaurants because they thought it was swine flu. There's no way the CDC would have known that, to put that in Korean on their website. They needed to be dealing with the Korean media, who could have told them that. You see what I mean? So there is a niche we have begun to fill that has generated a revenue stream, and that is going to this idea of convening communities, connecting people to each other and to, in this case, if the client is a CDC, or maybe it's a 2010 census. For the first time in the history of this country, a government agency, namely the census, paid over 50% of its ad dollars in 2010 to ethnic and community media. It was historic. It was a benchmark. And even then, they realized when they went to Houston, oh, said the Saigon radio of Houston, it's good it's in Vietnamese, but it's not Houston Vietnamese. So I'm not saying this therefore means all of you have to go out and necessarily connect with ethnic media, although I'm trying to say there is no such thing as ethnic media anymore. It's all we are all the media. And that the ability to go beyond gathering, interpreting, and disseminating information, which is how I thought of myself as a journalist, you can also be in the business of communication. And in that sense, ethnic media have been prophetic. They have been informers, and they've also been engagers, and they've also been mobilizers. Anyone who doubts Wen Li would be out of prison today without the Chinese media doesn't understand the role that media played in mobilizing Silicon Valley, which scared the hell out of Washington, okay? So it's not just African American media. We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. That was the mission statement of the first black newspaper Freedom Journal, 1827. And that remains the mission statement. So it's the we. You have, we all have the ability, if you're in health, to bring people together and to get consulting money, to get social marketing, raising awareness, visibility, create a swarm through blogs, whatever. But I'm just saying government, or let's say the public institutions, the public realm is having a real, facing a real challenge that it can't communicate inclusively, and there is a revenue stream possibility out of that.
I'll ask one more question, then we'll turn it over to Q&A from the audience. And that has to do with a word that you used, Sandy, which was engage. And I love that you used the verb to engage, because I think that we are a panel of people who do things and take action, instead of the buzzword of engagement, which is what funders and foundations so often ask us for. And when they ask us for that, they're asking for metrics. They want to know time on site. They want to know unique visitors. They want to know pages per visit. What can we do differently to communicate our missions to the people who we need to convince of that for sustainability?
The metrics that the PR firms excel at are fascinating examples of what never gets to the bone and really gives people a true sense of ownership. It glosses the surface. Okay, what do we do? One of the things is we are able to reach underserved audiences. And these are not audiences that necessarily blog. I don't know a single person in Coachella, California, including some of the young people who've gone back as children of farm workers from state universities and Ivy Leagues to run for office in those cities. They didn't go to K Street, they didn't go to Wall Street, they went back to Main Street. Very new face of politics in small town California. I don't know people who communicate through blogging in those areas. I don't know them in Stockton. I don't know them in Richmond. I do know.
They might Facebook, though.
Don't be too sure. We need a multiplicity of forums, and don't undercount the high touch for the high tech. There are ways you can capitalize on high touch without excluding high tech. And I'm a living example of being able to bring, okay, I will partner with Univision, and I will get 30,000 people to a health fair in Vegas or a housing conference in North Vegas at the height of the foreclosures. And HUD will pay me to do that. And it's because I have the relationships with the media who can do that call out. But there is no consummate, no similar black media in Vegas. So I went to every single church in North Vegas, black church. North Vegas is where blacks were only allowed to live up until 1964. So that's where they still live, in North Vegas for the most part. And that's where the foreclosure just swept. So all I'm saying is this, I love the word now, communicate. I love the notion of communication. And it can free us to think beyond the model of selling the journalistic product and help us support doing journalism. It's really, I'm not saying that it's the only way, but I can, if each of you were to tell me this is what I want to do, I might, at least in 10% of those cases, figure out a revenue stream that involves communication that ultimately supports the journalism. So what we're reinventing is the advertising component of the newspaper, but we're doing it in new ways that are using social media but not dependent on social media. The key thing that people really love, a client really wants, I want to explain to ethnic communities in California same-sex marriage. Can you imagine a more taboo topic than that? Bringing ethnic media together to talk about it. You know what happened? A third of the media came out at our briefings. They came out publicly for the first time. People wept. The woman from Clear Channel in Fresno, the radio station. I am so happy that this forum is taking place because I get to talk about myself as a lesbian. I've never been able to do that before. And the 3 Black octogenarian publishers, the key ones in California, came to that first briefing in Fresno, and this is what Bill Lee, the eldest, 82, said. I have been doing journalism for 40 years to make sure everyone's story gets told. Why should I stop with a same-sex couple? And that, I can tell you, this is not a, quote, liberal, progressive, defined sector. That's why I love it. It's on its own terms. And that resonated. Black media have been the gate opener in every city we've gone to in bringing other communities together. So I'm saying knitting communities together that are fractured through journalism, through communication, can generate revenue, especially if you've got agencies, be they the Department of Education, be they any number of agencies that we've been able to enlist to pay, and it can be a local Department of Health Services, because the institutions, the public institutions, the disconnect is growing wider because we've lost Walter Cronkite. We've lost that commons. So that's an opening for us.
Lisa, I hope you'll bring us back just a little bit and talk about how you're approaching engagement with your startup.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the whole thing of metrics, like how are you measured? I mean, in a mainstream newsroom, there's circulation numbers and awards were the, what I grew up with. It's like, how you're circulating in your awards. And what's interesting as an independent, and I'm only 2 years into being an independent journalist, but the traditional metrics is still what a lot of like the funders and even just people that we talk about the effort to ask, did you change public policy? Did any of your stories change public policy? Did you get picked up in the Boston Globe?
That's the McKenzieization.
Did you get picked up at the New York Times? Did you win any awards with it? But did you push the needle on public policy? And yes, we have. I mean, several of our stories have actually changed state and federal health and safety regulations. I'm not going to bore you with it, but yes, we're still doing that. But the metrics for us are different, because the metrics for us are, I'll just give you an example, but with the freedom of what we can do with an independent site that we couldn't do in a mainstream newspaper setting. And this is dumb, but school cafeteria inspections, okay, I'm a parent. But people would call over the years, even when I was in regular, in the newsroom, about, so what we decided to do, we work with 2 colleges, young people at Quinnipiac University and UConn, so we have student volunteers. But we just sent out a bunch of people to get inspections of every school cafeteria in the state. And we boiled it down and put it online and wrote a story and told parents, log in. And because if you want to see, we actually want to see data that was usually hidden from parents. I mean, unless you went to your school and dug, or your local health department. We did all that and we put it all online. and the system crashed. I mean, the website crashed within like an hour. Every parent in Connecticut was looking up like, oh my God, there were, rodents and, it's horrible in some schools. The whole website crashed. We had to like call an emergency data person to get it back up, and got it back up, it crashed again. That engaged people. To me, and there were the schools districts were so mad at us because everybody was calling their local school district and complaining and wanting to hold public meetings about what's going on in our kids' cafeteria. So that's engagement. But
can you imagine rats in the cafeteria?
right, but to me that's engagement. But it doesn't show up in any metrics that anybody's measuring what the.
You listen, as a survivor in the foundation world, you do not let them define the terms.
No, but I'm just saying
you have to.
I think there has to be a new metrics.
Okay, and what you might want to do, because the federal government has just established Healthy, Hungry, Free Kids Act.
Yeah.
With high nutrition standards only most parents don't know. Can you turn around all those people who called you and say, we are now going to do an advertising campaign?
There you go. Yeah,
okay.
We might. But the point being, I don't know. It's all new. I mean, we are the same. I'm not nearly as evolved as Sandy. Honestly, in either thinking about what we do or knowing how to engage communities. I'm like an idiot. I really am a dumb reporter. But I don't have a like a.
I highly, highly doubt that.
No, but in terms of like thinking about the greater purpose of journalism building, I hear you and you educate me, but I'm just like I want to like expose wrongdoing and
this is where
the finances get in the way.
They get in the way.
No,
yes.
but this is where real lessons learned and sharing can come about.
Help.
And Joe, do you have any?
Joe runs a similar center in Boston to ours, doing investigative, but more politics, not. Yes. So he's the.
Actually, talking about ethnic media, when we launched the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, we tried to create a component of working with ethnic media. We couldn't find anyone to fund it, and we tried. We even tried individuals who were interested in the subject. So I'm sort of looking for.
And we were too interested in funding it, and the recession hit, and it was a problem.
But as you speak here, it reminds me of why we decided to do that when we launched, and that we need to go back and think about that because it's a tremendously powerful in this area. The Hispanic media is, the Asian media is to some extent, I think. But I'd like to hear your advice on how to revisit that and how to get people to think about funding it here in the Massachusetts area.
Maybe the most successful foundation approach we've had to support collaborative reporting projects with ethnic media. We've been able to raise money, grants. We just did a toxic tour of 10 ethnic media journalists in Phoenix to go to the Navajo coal-fired generating plant. And that was their idea. They wanted to go. Can you imagine how exciting it is to take Chinese, Arab, Muslim, Black, Burmese in Phoenix, and Hispanic media to the Navajo and Hopi and do a 2-day toxic tour. Okay, that raised $15,000. This was a collaboration of 12 media in California to look at the faces of foreclosure, 1.2 million foreclosures in a 2-year period, and no John Steinbeck. The majority of these are Spanish, Black, and Asian. How do you tell their story? Can 12 ethnic media journalists in each of their communities do a profile? And then Joe Rodriguez comes out and photographs them, which of course is the glue. But you can, if you think of those like reentry, like all of these stories around us, if you think of ethnic media as bureaus for you, where individual reporters can do a bureau chief's job, not as well perhaps because they don't have the training, and you can build in a fellowship that gives them the training, then you get real partners. And we can replicate this now on all sorts of things, but they're small. And look, I don't want to take up more time with the sustainability issue, you know, which could be very boring for people.
It's a big one.
Okay, okay.
Sandy, can I ask you, are you able to aggregate the information that your network creates about those communities to people in Washington?
Well, yes, I mean, to people in Washington, you know, we have a website and we're published in ethnic media. We're an AP of ethnic media, if you will. I used to be PNS, which was a boutique news service for mainstream media, and I've never lost that ambition. This is about all, you know, we're all in the business, except I think you do better in communicating stories. You have a website, you send out emails, you know, distribute through Facebook, but I think we built our brand through events. I think we built them through having awards that gave prizes to reporters who would otherwise remain totally invisible. And we had the editor of the Washington Post, Len Downey, then present the award. He suddenly looks and says, my God, look at all these young journalists. I didn't know they were out there. And so you're educating people. You can do very high impact. Of course, we met at one of your events.
But my policy has been made in Washington by people whose understanding of what's going on out in the countryside is very limited.
It's very limited.
And off base.
Yeah.
And you have thousands of people like you out there gathering information about what people really think, and that is.
It's a very, very good issue.
I think distribution is a real key aspect of it, and that's why INN has become such a beacon of hope, because there's a real demand for content. So Thomson Reuters and about 7 other major distributors have come to INN and said, we'll take your material and we will distribute it. And that's, the engine is starting. And pretty soon, this is going to be another kind of AP. And it's going to be maybe under the INN umbrella, I don't know. But the one person in Oklahoma typing on a laptop can be globally distributed. And I think Washington's going to have to pay attention when you start seeing those stories picked up.
At that point, does it stop being independent?
I think if you're the independent person in Oklahoma typing the story and it doesn't get damaged in any way, it's just a funnel. It's just a great big, better funnel. So yeah, I think you're still independent. I mean, in the spirit of I.F. Stone, I think he would be wanting his material distributed today in a much larger funnel than his newsletters were, because he could see that it's possible now.
We had a question right here.
Yes, I wanted to ask, it gets a little bit off your subject, but the concept of how much clout, sort of under the radar clout, that ethnic media has. For example, I lived in the Coachella Valley, and we tried for many years to get Mary Bono to feed it. And the newspaper was pro-Mary Bono all the time. This year, a Hispanic won, and he won in part because of the ethnic media that was out there, and it was just funneling here and there. He didn't get the clout from the mainstream paper that was out there. He had none of that endorsement. But it seems to me that there's a growing, because of the ethnicity changes, that there's a growing clout in these kind of papers that you're talking about, even though there seems this disparity of, being able to get funded. But I wondered if you could answer that.
The cloud, I think, hit home in 2006 with the massive immigration demonstrations, which really put not Univision on the map, because it was really Spanish language radio, and it was La Opinión, because that's where the biggest march was. The entire page of La Opinión was a las calles. It was the whole page. And it again is that platform for the collective we, which can be very dangerous, very sensorial. And Chauncey Bailey was killed, you know, for speaking truth to community, as dangerous as speaking truth to power. But on the other hand, these media have a phenomenal ability, and we just got money to message out to ethnic audiences in California that there is a government-supervised independent foreclosure review process. The deadline is December 31st. People could qualify for $125,000 for relief if they suffered from economic distress through unfair foreclosure proceedings. Do you know that not a single dollar has been distributed? And that most people don't know it exists. And this, so you know, this is where the problem that Bill is raising of communicating to Washington, and also these agencies, petrified. They don't know how is HUD going to communicate. It pays a PR firm a fortune. The PR firm doesn't have a clue what these Houston Vietnamese people want. And so that's a possibility. Anyway, I'm very anxious to talk to anyone individually about how we might connect. I see such old friends in the room, and very, very grateful to you for coming. I want to just really thank Shujun for joining us, and Lisa and Peggy for coming up from Washington, and you've given me inspiration for 2013. Thank you, Ms. Daughter of Izzy.
All right, and thank you all for coming. We'll be available afterwards.